Hi, Nick Tyrone, neoliberal centrist dad. So I'm here to talk about Reform Conference, and I want to get right down to it. Yeah, I have been in Birmingham. Well, not really actually Birmingham, because it was right by Birmingham International Airport, which is quite a ways out of Birmingham, in fact, and kind of in the middle of nowhere, other than the fact that there's an airport there. But you've got the airport, and you've got a bunch of hotels, and you've got a big conference center, which is where Reform decided to have their conference this year. And it was interesting in the sense that most of the past, how should I put this, Nigel Farage vehicle party conferences, right? So UKIP, if you go back in the day, Brexit Party, there was something last year Reform did. I can't even remember anything about it, to be honest. I wasn't there. They tended to be essentially glorified rallies. So you'd have a rally that was really about Farage and his warm-up acts, basically speaking about reformy, Brexity Party, UKIP stuff. And then Farage comes out, gives a big speech. And there might be some stuff around it, that is conferencey. But it wasn't a conference in the traditional sense, spread over several days with fringe events, with other stuff, basically. Stuff that isn't just Farage on a stage. So this felt like their first attempt, at least a sort of mini version of what the other parties do every year in terms of party political conferences. Now, I'm just going to do a quick thing because lots of you knowing this will know lots about party political conferences. Some of you will know nothing. Most of you will probably be in between. Basically, every autumn, we have something called party political conference season in Britain. And it's very different to what they have in America, where you only have a conference every 4 years to sort of right before a presidential election. This is every single year. People basically turn up in wherever the conference is. It used to be very seaside town orientated. That's what they did. They did it in Birmingham, Brighton, Bournemouth. They still sometimes happen there. But it's interesting, actually, Labour and Tory, who are the two biggest parties, generally don't do seaside towns. In fact, the last time Labour's done Brighton in recent memory, but the Tories haven't done a seaside town since, it's been 20 years probably since, and that was Blackpool, probably 20 years ago. Something like that. Anyway, they turn up, and what do you have over 3 days? You have a lot of speeches in a main hall, which tend to be the politicians, the MPs, if you're in government, the ministers, if you're the opposition party, the shadow ministers, and they give speeches about what the party is going to do. Then you have fringe events, which are these side meetings in little rooms where they're generally put on by think tanks or companies, or anyone can put them on. The point being is whoever might want to just get a room together to talk about a particular issue. Maybe it's the environment. Maybe it is farming policy. Could be anything. And they will get politicians from that party and journalists to be on a panel, and they will talk about that issue. And then you'll have a room full of people. Ideal is generally between 50 and 100. They can be bigger, they can be smaller. Generally, when they're bigger, they get a little bit too much to handle. Generally, when they're smaller, they're a bit sort of sad and depressing and a bit pointless. But anyway, that's what a conference is, right? And then in the meantime, you have a bar. You usually generally have a hotel. You have activists mixing in with lobbyists and politicians and journalists, and everybody gets drunk and talks, and that's the basic idea. And the point also being is that the party in question who's holding the conference gets a lot of press attention off the back of the conference. And oftentimes, as has happened in the past, a poll boost. So they're a good thing for the parties, generally speaking. They can also go horribly wrong, and someone can say something or do something weird. I mean, a great example would be, 2017? It must have been 2017 when Theresa May gave a really terrible speech when she was Prime Minister at Tory conference. She had this terrible cold, and she was desperately trying to fight through it to just give this speech, but it was just awful, and she was obviously looked just like death. And then the sign on the back, because usually you have a slogan or something because it's going to be on the news. So whatever strength, confidence, whatever was the Tory slogan at the time, the letters started falling off one by one. So conference can go horribly wrong, but generally speaking, they are good things for you, and all the activists get together and everybody gets to communicate and blah, blah, blah. So clearly Reform were to some extent trying to stamp themselves on the political landscape with this conference. They were trying to say, we are one of the big guys. We are We are amongst the proper political parties. We are not a fringe group. We're not a fringe party. This is the mainstream. So I'll talk you through it. Birmingham International. I arrived Friday quite early. I wanted to get in there pretty early. There was a big queue to get in. They hadn't quite got that right, I'll be honest. So generally speaking, what the other bigger parties will do is they will take your details when you register. You'll have to provide ID and a whole bunch of other stuff, and they kind of check you out, figure out who you are, figure out, if you have a history of, like, you're a terrorist, it would be a good one, or some sort of violent criminal, or even just someone who might have a, how shall I put this, non-pure reason to be there. You might be like some sort of noted activist who, sprays orange paint on things when they get inside. So you check that out, and so what that does is that will simplify people getting in the building. So basically they have everybody's photo ID on record, and they can put it all into like a QR code. You walk through airport-style security, then they like click your badge, they can see that you're fine, you've been approved, on you go. And it's very quick. And generally speaking, unless it's a real time of like huge groups of people showing up, you tend to work very quickly and you're not in a queue for very long. This was like, they kind of did a lot of that on site. So you had to keep showing photo ID, for instance, was a big thing. And then you had to queue up and like then get your pass, because generally your pass would come in the post for Tory or Labour or Lib Dem or whatever. You had to get your pass there, and everybody had to do that, so that was really quite time-consuming. It took more than an hour to get in the building, which is kind of a lot. But anyway, I just want to I'm being honest here, and I want to point out all the good and the bad. So that was the first thing. It kind of made you think this could be organized a little bit better. Probably will be in the future, let's face it. This was somewhat of a dry run for this sort of thing for these guys. First big conference, so fine. It was a bit ready to get in. Once I was in, I was really surprised at how full it was, how many people were there already, day one, quite early in the morning. I spoke to a lot of people in the queue because I was there for a while. I spoke to a lot of people that I was inside that were just normal reform people, reform activists, or people who'd, I don't know, wanted to come check out Reform Conference and weren't particularly political. The interesting thing about the reform activists really is, this is going to annoy some people, but I have to be honest. They are much more normal than most people who go to political conferences. Like, they are much more normal than the people who are activisty or party people who go to Lib Dem, Labour, or Tory. Generally speaking, is what I would say. There's way more than just normal people who have normal jobs and normal lives and don't obsess about politics and don't spend their entire lives focused on politics. So that was interesting. It was interesting to be at a conference where people were like, I don't know. I mean, the one thing I can say is every reform activist I spoke to, we'd speak about, just various things, and I kind of asked them what interests them about reform. Interestingly enough, immigration came up way less than any of you would think. A lot of it was around state of the NHS, cost of living. Those were the big ones that people talked about and why they were attracted to reform. They, one of the things I asked every single one of them was, who is Robert or what do you think of Robert Jenrick? What's your opinion of Robert Jenrick? Because I wanted to know what they thought about the Tories and if they could come back. Were these people sort of in the market for the Conservative Party at some point? And by far the most common answer, I mean, I think only one guy said something different, was, who? They didn't even know who Jenrick was. I thought that was kind of really interesting and kind of refreshing in a way. I think this is kind of idea that all the reform people are all these, they're horribly right-wing people who would have been in the BNP in the past. I'm sorry, that's just bullshit. It really is. Maybe some of them are more right-wing than your personal politics, but a lot of the reform people at conference were just really, really normal. And again, way more normal than the other ones. I mean, I swear to God, about half the Lib Dem activists at Lib Dem conference are like, it's like they came out of a Lib Dem activist factory. They all have the same weird opinions, the same weird obsessions with weird stuff that no one else is obsessed with other than Lib Dem activists. Labour's a bit better in the sense that it's like, it's a broader church, but again, it's a bit like going to a religious thing Labour conference. That's why always been my thing about the Labour Party in Britain. It's very kind of churchy, like as in you all have to kind of believe in the power of the Labour to be a force for good, and it's I don't know. I just think it's a bit weird. I just genuinely do. And then Tory conference. I mean, 90% of the people there are lobbyists and journalists and corporate people and basically people who are there to sort of, movers and shakers, basically. Have no real connection to the Conservative Party other than the fact that they want to do some business. They want to be on the inside track. It's one of the reasons why Tory conference tends to really suffer when they're in opposition, because most of the people who go are people who want to be close to the government. So yeah, to be at a conference where it was like, 80% just like normal people who wanted to check things out and just have sort of quite normal concerns. I mean, the thing it really reminded me of, I have spent the last sort of year and a half, a little bit more now, almost 2 years, traveling around Britain, traveling to a lot of what you might call left behind Britain. I've spent a reasonable amount of time on Teesside, in Hartlepool, Middlesbrough, Redcar. I've been to a lot of, sort of the poorer parts of the Midlands. I've been to, places like Rotherham, which have been in the news for their particular problems. And in terms of the feel of like when I speak to people in those places, this felt like that. These are just like, it's kind of Middle Britain. This is Middle Britain. And I think actually Liberals should really be concerned by that. The fact that Middle England is really attracted to Reform and probably not really any other party. It's one of the reasons why I think Reform have a very good chance of winning the next general election, because like it or not, right? I disagree with them, whatever. I think they, for whatever reason, they have captured sort of your average person in Britain much better than anyone else has. So anyway, that's one thing to say. The other thing to say is there were a lot of people there that I wouldn't have expected to be there. So, for instance, I had a pint with a Lib Dem peer, as in a Lib Dem lord, who I hadn't seen in a long time, and he was there because, he wanted to check it out. Lots of, like, real intellectual types, Institute for Government kind of people, way more than I would have thought. A lot of actually, like, center-left think tank people. Like, there's a lot of people who are like, we need to know about this. We need to get it. Something I just didn't expect. Like, people I hadn't seen in a long time who are not Reform people at all. Like, I mean, at all. They're about as far from Reform politically as you can get. And they were there. And they were checking it out. And a lot of them came away with, because they hadn't really been around anything Reform related. I've covered a few things as a journalist. So I'd sort of seen it before a little bit. And, one in particular, a think tank director, center-left think tank, came up to me and said, oh shit, Reform are going to win the next election, aren't they? Like, it's really dawned on her being there, like, for the first time, being able to see it and being able to see the energy that was there, and the sort of excitement, and all the people who aren't just weird people who've been Reform activists for 20 years, because there are no people who've been Reform activists for 20 years because they haven't been around for 20 years. So yeah, that was really, really interesting. In terms of the setup, it was very odd, because basically you had the main hall, which is where all the speeches and stuff happened, and then you kind of had what you'd have, which is like an exhibition hall where people have stalls and stuff like that, and the breakout rooms, the fringe rooms, all in one huge room, which was kind of chaos, and I really hope they don't do that again, because it didn't really quite work. They kind of got away with it. But it was really, I mean, some of the events were really, really interesting. I mean, they were interesting both in and of themselves, and also they were interesting in terms of getting to the heart of, like, the real kind of contradictions that exist, on the British right, but also just in the Western right, generally. So there was one, that was really good. It was Michael Gove, who turned up to interview Zaya Youssef, who was the chair. Then he quit. It was a whole big thing. Now he's basically head of policy for UKIP, for Reform, and that was a really interesting interview. There was one bit where a journalist asked about Israel, And I'm not saying he didn't come out and say free Palestine or anything. He certainly didn't. But he was a little bit, I don't know. It was interesting the way he handled the question. I'll leave it there, but I thought that was interesting. And then there was a great panel that the Center for Social Justice, they're a centre-right think tank, and they were put on a thing about the crisis for boys, and that was really interesting in and of itself. But the thing that was really interesting was it didn't take long before they got to this idea of like, porn's really bad, porn's horrible, porn is really bad for men because it's making men violent and making them have terrible relationships with women, so they can't get in relationships with women, so they end up as incels, and then they end up as violent criminals, and all this sort of stuff. And you had people on the panel who ranged from, we need to ban all porn immediately, to, no, like, we can't interfere, it's free speech, etc. And it really gets down to that sort of like religious right thing and libertarianism, which, it's so strange to me that like we're in 2025 and people still can't understand that these two things are in mass opposition with each other and really rub against each other really quite badly. And when you get down to something like that's brass tacks, like something like what should we do about porn, they have precisely opposite views, right? And so seeing that all come out was really fascinating, because you'd think you'd get that at Tory conference, right? But Tory conference is so like slick, and it's so corporate, and you just never get stuff like that anymore at Tory conference. Once upon a time you did. I can, in my memory of going to Tory conference, if you go back to like way in the mists, but now, no, it's just very corporate, and having a kind of discussion like that would be really icky there for them. They go, oh, controversy. Let's all just like agree on Thatcher was great or whatever. So the main hall, the thing about the main hall is it was absolutely rammed. It was huge. I mean, it was a bit like the thing you get at Reform, which is like, it feels like a show. It feels like almost like entertainment. Like people are clapping, they're whooping, they're really into it. I mean, you have to understand the difference between that and say something like Conservative Party conference, right? Conservative Party conference, the hall, unless you have like someone who is just like at their peak in terms of being loved by the activists, and it's really entertaining. So when Boris Johnson, like pre-2016, so Boris Johnson kind of when he was mayor, right? 2008 to like 2015, let's say. That was different, because the hall would be packed, and he was actually, the thing is actually about Boris is like he was kind of funny back in his day. He really was, before the stress of life crushed him or whatever. He was funny. He would actually make jokes in his speeches that were actually funny, and he could carry them off. And so people would pack the hall for that, and that had a different vibe. But generally speaking, they were filled with quite old people who were mostly asleep, and about half full at best. I mean, I really remember one during the coalition years where William Hague was the foreign secretary, and he was up speaking, and he was giving this like foreign affairs, the kind of, guff. I say guff. I mean, like all of it was factual, and what's the word? I'm like not punchy. It wasn't punchy. I'm trying to think of the right word here. Worthy, I guess, is probably right. All good stuff about like, we're talking to China and this is what we're getting to, and here are the good things and here are the bad things, and this is what we're worried about in Eastern Europe, etc., etc., etc. And then I really remember this because I was quite close to the stage, and I'm just looking at the sea of old people completely asleep at William Hague talking about the world. And then Hague kind of did this, he took this moment, and it was like a microsecond, but just having been around politics as long as I have, like I got it, where his brain, he clicked into a different mode. And then he said, I'll try and do Hague as best I can, and it's not going to be a good impression, so don't think it's a good impression, but I have to kind of get into it a little bit here. So he said, and the blasted bureaucrats in Brussels, they will not stand in our way as we try and make our way as a nation, something like that. Bureaucrats, Brussels was in there. And suddenly, everybody comes alive, right? Everybody wakes up, and they're like, and Hague does this kind of like Eurosceptic like guff for about 30 seconds. And everybody loves it. And then he goes, okay. And GDP figures in Bulgaria. And then everybody goes back to sleep. So that is other conferences, right? This was like a real show and people coming out. Now, some of it was, as some of you who followed it on social media and where elsewhere, some of it was kind of naff, like really, really naff. We have to address it. Andrea Jenkins singing. It was weird. It was kind of like, okay. So there was like a fair amount of naffness, but again, I'd kind of say that like some of the naffness is like kind of part of the appeal that, again, I don't think liberals or even just people on the center right who don't like reform get, right? It's that seaside town, panto thing. It's something sort of really deeply English about it that I think is actually important. A little bit of naffness. You kind of need it as part of the mix, I think. I think other parties have sort of forgotten that a little bit. I remember there was a thing. It happens in America too. I remember there was this thing around the 2024 election. I'm pretty sure it was. Maybe it was 2020. This is the thing. I'm getting old. All these things blur into one. But basically, it was like one of those shows. It was like, what's his name? John Oliver, or maybe it was like a late night talk show. Something very left aligned in America. And they were doing this thing about like Democrat conference and Republican conference, and like all the clips of Democrat conference was people talking about very worthy things in very stentorian language, very 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 officious, very like, we know what we're talking about, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do this, and then they were, it was like a montage, and they're cutting between these clips of Democrat conference, the Democrats being terribly sensible, and then like a Republican conferences, it was like Hulk Hogan ripping his shirt off and going or whatever. The point that they thought that was saying is like, look at how serious the Democrats are, and look at how silly the stupid Republicans are. And it really stuck in my mind because I'm like, yeah, but to most people, right, who aren't that interested in politics, A, they're going to look at the Democrats and go, well, most of that stuff's boring. And B, actually, you're just full of shit anyway. You never fix anything. So why am I taking any of this seriously? At least the Hulk Hogan ripping his shirt off thing is fun, right? And that's the thing about Reform Conference. It's like, yeah, Andrea Jenkins singing a little bit off key and frankly quite a bit off time. Pretty naff, right? Dumb. But kind of fun. Sticks in your brain. And a lot of it was like that. A lot of it, David Bull, again, I think he's pretty good for them, at least in terms of like doing this compare thing at their events. Yeah, it's really naff, but it's kind of fun, and I think like just people who aren't that obsessed with politics kind of like it. Again, another lesson for people. There was some like really bad stuff. It has to be said. So it's the unquestionable bad stuff was the anti-vax doctor. I can't remember his name, and I'm not going to look it up, and I don't care. I'm not going to actually say his name on this video. If you are interested, it's easy to find out. You can Google this in 5 seconds. But there's some guy, he's an anti-vaxxer, and he was talking about how vaccines are giving the royal family cancer or some shit. It's all, it was bonkers stuff. And actually the fact that Reform allowed it on the stage is insane. And again, it speaks to the weakness of Reform. I think one of their the things that they're going to have to really think about the closer we get to a general election. And I appreciate that's a long way away probably, but they really, that crazy stuff. Farage has tried to do his best with the like, Tommy Robinson is not going to join the party and really keep his distance from some of the kookier bits of the online right. But then suddenly, boof, you had it right there. It was like right in your face. And I was sat there in the hall thinking, he's actually done a good job of yeah, it's been naff, but I haven't seen any really crazy stuff. And then suddenly, the crazy anti-vax stuff. And it's right there, and it's right on stage. And you thought, oh, God. And actually, to be fair to the crowd, there were parts of the crowd that really loved it. There were parts of the crowd that felt really uncomfortable and didn't like it. So I thought that was a negative. You had Lucy Connolly. Now, I've made videos about the fact that I didn't think Lucy Connolly should have been in prison. And it's weird to me, and it's kind of depressing, because it's like this thing about people not really understanding what I'm getting at. It's me as a free speech warrior. I'm a real free speech person. I wasn't trying to say that I thought Lucy Connolly, what she said was right, or even not terrible. I just didn't think she should be in prison for it. I just didn't think that we should be imprisoning people for speech, really, unless it was really extreme. People can disagree with me on that. That's what I thought. But, oh, God, like, what? She's not a martyr. She's not someone to look up to, or like, she screwed up. She screwed up really badly. and I feel badly for what happened to her, and I could probably even get to the point where I could think of her as a victim. But yeah, think of her as a victim, not as someone to have on stage celebrating. So I thought that was weird. I thought that was a bit much. And then so was that. There was also the one thing I want to touch on as well is, so Nadine Dorries, the ex-Tory culture minister, who was known for, how shall I put this delicately, having a bit of a thing for Boris Johnson, shall we say. There's all these pictures, you'll find them on the internet, of her looking lovingly at him in a slightly bedroom-eyesy way. But anyway, I digress. So she's come out for reform. And she's... the way she was unveiled on stage was really weird. It was really interesting. So Farage gave a little interview. He was in the midst of a speech and said, now I've got some good news. As some of you may know, Nadine Dorries, ex-Tory minister, and it just shows how reform is getting, people who used to be ministers to come, blah, blah, blah. He's sort of talking it up, but in a slightly half-assed way where you're like, okay, this is a weird vibe. And he just goes, please welcome to the stage Nadine Dorries. Now, this is the key. So Dorries comes up on stage, right? And Farage, as soon as he's introduced her, just buggers off. He, scoodles off the stage. Doesn't greet her, right? Doesn't, give her a handshake, put his arm around her. None of that. No. He buggers off. And I think that was entirely intentional. There was a sort of because there was a lot of humming and hawing from I spoke to a few local organizers, reform organizers, and they were like, don't like the Dorries thing. Are we the retirement home for failed Tories? This is a bad look. And I agree with them. I think it is a bad look, and I think it's a big thing that reform have to think about. Are they just going to let any washed-up Tory? And sure enough, immediately, Dorries is on media today, talking about, how Farage has to have a pact with her, or he has to come together with Boris Johnson or whatever. Easily one of the worst things he could do. Genuinely, that would be horrific for Farage, particularly given, you have to understand, you're at Reform Conference, right? The amount of shit talked about Boris Johnson. These people, right, reform activists, really hate Johnson. They hate Johnson way more than Starmer, for instance. To them, Starmer's just, another stupid lefty who doesn't get it, and it's just a bit up his own arse, and, he's some socialist whatever. And they don't like him. But the point is, there's people like that in the world, and what can you do? Boris, however, Johnson is someone who they probably a lot of them voted for in 2019, right? He was going to get Brexit done, and he was going to do all this stuff, and it was going to be all this stuff. And then they look at him as the guy who just let the floodgates open, and there's all this immigration, and they blame him. They've got a name for it. It's called Boris Wave, right? That's what they call it. It was in there'd be events on at Reform Conference going, post Boris Wave, what do we do, blah, 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 or how do the Tories recover from Boris Wave? The idea that Boris Johnson would be attractive to reform activists is insane. And again, just shows Dorries doesn't know anything about reform. She's come over. She's just another one of these Tories who thinks oh, this will be nice. This will be a place to go. Have another kick at the can. Mistake, I think. So I'm just trying to think if there's any other major things or any other major goss. There was this big thing that was going around the hall. This was interesting. So on the morning of the first day, several people, and I mean several people who are reasonably senior in reform, their sources, I don't want to give them away, but people who they should know, right? Said Rees-Mogg's he's going to defect. It's happening. Nigel's going to announce it on stage. Rees-Mogg's going to join reform. And they said it with such gusto. And then I got a text from someone I know who's in the know about some of these things and has good context, good source, right? Not a reform person, but a very solid source on the right. Gave me a text saying the same thing. And I'm hearing this at Reform Conference. And it just seems so widespread that I just assumed, this must be true. I did sort of think, oh, I'll believe it when I see it. But I also thought, there's several people saying this. So you have to sort of think that there was something to it. Was it discussed? Did Rees-Mogg decide to do it and then back out? I mean, this is all conjecture, and I have no idea. Maybe it was all complete crap. But it's just interesting to me that there was this Rees-Mogg question. Was there a worry, when Dorries went down like a bag of sick with the local organizers? Did they think, actually, we can't announce another, really Tory-ish Tory? I don't know. But anyway, yeah, to summarize, Reform Conference was very energetic, and I actually had a great time. Like, I'm sorry to say, I had a really great time. That was the most fun I've had at a political conference in years. Because here's the thing, I'm I'm a politics junkie. I really like being around it. I know a lot of people in politics across all parties in Britain, and I have generally a good time being amongst politicos. But I have to say, like, Labour and Tory conference recently, over the last few years, has been a bit more boring than it used to be. And I would really... Reform kind of felt like the old days. Lots of buzzy activists running around thinking they're going to win the next election. And yeah, it was really interesting. It was a really interesting couple of days. And I was worried that it was going to be boring. Like, I thought it would be, what if not a lot of people show up? What if it's just a shit show? What if it's really badly organized? What if I'm finding myself, sitting around with a bunch of people who are sort of BNP light or BNP plus? I mean, I don't know. I didn't think that was going to happen, but like, it was kind of on my mind as a possibility. And anyway, it wasn't like that at all. I feel like there's probably bits of goss or stuff. Okay, one last thing. So I have a very good friend who happens to be he's a really great friend of mine. We're very close, and he's a photographer. He's a very, very talented photographer, and he had been hired to do to photograph a bunch of events at Reform Conference. This isn't a surprise. He does a lot of political stuff. Because actually everybody's figured out how good he is. Anyway, we were sat having a drink at the end of the night. He'd finished an event, and I was just sort of done. I was burnt out. It was just like 10 o'clock or whatever. So we're having a drink in the hotel. And he says, yeah, I have to tell you this. So there was a donor, apparently some sort of, either a Reform donor or a Tory donor that was thinking about donating to Reform. There's a lot of them, all right? Anyway, older woman, and my friend gets in the lift, and she starts talking to him in this very familiar kind of way. Now, as background on this dear friend of mine happens to be of ethnically Asian, right? It's an important part of the story, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. Anyway, she starts talking to him about, like, I really want to get involved in the party more, and I really think you and I should have lunch, and we should really discuss this. And my friend's just kind of going, okay. This woman clearly thinks she knows me, or... And it became clear to my friend very quickly that this woman thinks I'm someone I'm not. So anyway, he's kind of going along with it. And then it quickly becomes clear that she thinks he's Zaya Yusuf. Now, the funniest thing about this is, apart from also being an Asian man, my friend looks literally nothing whatsoever like Zaya Yusuf. Like, nothing. They're not, like, remotely close in age. They're not remotely close in height. They just look completely different from each other. And it was the one bit of, like, because I know I've been very, I have said, like, I didn't find any racist stuff at Reform. Actually, immigration didn't even come up that much. That was the one moment. But I think this is just some old Tory-ish woman who just can't tell Asian men apart. But anyway, I did think, I'll leave you with that one. My name's Nick Tyrone, Neoliberal Centrist Dad. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any other questions about Reform Conference, I would love to field them. It was an interesting couple of days where so much happened, actually, that I couldn't get to it all. And I don't want to go on any longer because I want to try and keep this video is actually too long already. And I want to try and stop it here. But anyway, if you've got this far into the video, I assume you've got something out of it. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel. All that helps a lot. And I'll be back soon with another video. Right, take care, guys. Bye.